The moment Graham Kingsley pointed at the concert grand and said, "If you can't play, you don't eat," every phone in the Meridian Grand's restaurant turned toward the trembling homeless girl standing by the host stand. She wore 3 jackets layered against the January cold, her fingerless gloves exposing hands red and cracked from sleeping on subway grates. The billionaire hotel tycoon smirked at his lunch companions, already savoring the humiliation he'd orchestrated. But when 19-year-old Lena Hart walked toward that piano, her steps carried something the room didn't expect. The quiet certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far Lena's story travels. And if her journey moves you, hit that like button. Let's make sure stories like this reach the people who need to hear them most. The brass revolving door of the Meridian Grand Hotel expelled a gust of frigid January air into the marble lobby, carrying with it the acrid smell of exhaust fumes and the distant wail of sirens, the permanent soundtrack of Manhattan's financial district. Inside, warmth wrapped around the guests like cashmere, insulating them from the brutal realities that existed just beyond the polished threshold. Lena Hart stood in that in-between space, neither fully inside nor completely out, her breath still forming small clouds in the air despite the lobby's expensive heating system. Her body trembled, though she couldn't tell anymore if it was from cold or hunger or the bone-deep exhaustion that had become her constant companion over the past 8 months. She'd walked past this building 100 times, maybe more, always at a distance, always with her head down, trained by experience to make herself invisible to the kind of people who frequented places like this. But today, desperation had rewritten the rules she lived by. 3 days without food did that. The host stand for Luminescence, the hotel's flagship restaurant, sat just ahead, positioned like a checkpoint between the lobby's public space and the sanctum of white tablecloths and crystal stemware beyond. Lena could see it through the frosted glass panels, the soft golden lighting, the carefully arranged flower centerpieces, the gentle clink of silverware against china that spoke of a world where meals were experiences, not survival. Her feet carried her forward before her mind could manufacture another reason to turn back. The woman behind the host stand noticed her immediately. Of course she did. Lena knew what she looked like. 3 jackets layered over a frame that had lost 20 pounds it couldn't afford to lose, jeans with holes that weren't fashion statements, boots held together with duct tape that had long since lost its stick. The fingerless gloves she wore had once been a gift from her mother. Soft cashmere dyed a deep burgundy. Now they were threadbare and stained, exposing fingers that were chapped and raw from too many nights when even the shelter system had been full. "Can I help you?" The hostess's tone carried the peculiar politeness of someone trained to handle awkward situations without causing scenes. Her eyes had already performed a full assessment, cataloging Lena as a problem to be efficiently removed. Lena's throat felt like sandpaper. She'd practiced this moment in her head during the long walk down Fifth Avenue, had rehearsed exactly what she'd say. But standing here now, under the subtle but unmistakable scrutiny of wealth, the words tangled themselves into knots. "I'm looking for work," she finally managed, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "Any work. Kitchen, cleaning, anything. I can start right now. I'm a hard worker, I promise. She swallowed hard. "I just need a chance." The hostess's expression shifted through several micro-expressions: surprise, discomfort, pity, irritation, before settling into professional neutrality. "I'm sorry, but we don't handle hiring at the host stand. You'd need to submit an application through the hotel's website and, please." The word came out more desperately than Lena intended. "I don't have access to a computer. I don't have an address for them to mail anything to. I just need to talk to someone. Anyone who might... Is there a problem here, Michelle?" The new voice came from a man approaching the host stand with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no in a context that mattered. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair swept back from a face that spoke of expensive skincare and excellent genetics. His suit probably cost more than Lena had spent on rent in the entire year before her life collapsed. Michelle, the hostess, straightened automatically. "No problem, Mr. Kingsley. This young woman was just leaving." "Was she?" Graham Kingsley turned his full attention to Lena, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. His eyes were a pale gray, cold and assessing. What's your name, dear? The endearment dripped with condescension, but Lena was too tired and too hungry to parse the subtle cruelties of tone. Lena Hart. And what brings you to Luminescence today, Lena Hart? Surely not a reservation. His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm looking for work, sir. Any kind of work. I can clean, I can wash dishes, Can you play piano? The question hit her like a slap, so unexpected that for a moment she just stared at him. What? Graham gestured toward the restaurant's interior, where Lena could now see a magnificent concert grand piano positioned on a small raised platform near the windows. The instrument gleamed under carefully positioned spotlights, its black lacquer surface reflecting the room like dark water. That piano, Graham continued, his voice carrying enough volume that nearby guests turned to watch. It's a Steinway Model D, cost me nearly $200,000. Beautiful, isn't it? I had it installed 6 months ago to give the restaurant some ambiance. He paused, and his smile widened. But here's the thing, Lena Hart. I believe in meritocracy, in earned rewards, so I'll make you a deal. Lena's pulse kicked up, though some instinct deep in her gut was already sending warning signals she was too desperate to heed. If you can play that piano, really play it, not just plink out chopsticks. I'll personally see to it that you get a hot meal from our kitchen. The chef's tasting menu even. 7 courses. He leaned in slightly. But if you can't play, if you waste my time and the time of everyone in this restaurant, you leave immediately and you don't come back. Do we have an understanding? The trap was obvious, even to someone as exhausted and hungry as Lena. He was setting her up for public humiliation, manufacturing entertainment for himself and his wealthy lunch companions. She could see them now. 3 other expensively dressed men at a table near the piano, already watching with the keen interest of people who sensed a spectacle brewing. Every rational thought screamed at her to refuse, to walk away, to preserve what little dignity she had left. But the thought of 7 courses of food, real food, not the watery soup and stale bread from the shelter when she was lucky enough to get there before capacity, made her mouth water so intensely it hurt. And beneath the hunger, beneath the desperation, something else stirred, something she'd tried to bury along with everything else from her previous life. A flicker of the girl she'd been before the world took everything from her. I can play, she heard herself say. Wonderful. Graham clapped his hands together, and the sharp sound made several diners jump. Michelle, please show our aspiring musician to the piano. Ladies and gentlemen, he raised his voice, addressing the restaurant at large. You're about to witness either a remarkable performance or a valuable lesson about knowing one's place. Either way, I promise you'll find it memorable. Lena's legs felt like water as Michelle led her through the restaurant. She was acutely aware of every eye following her progress, of the whispered conversations starting up in her wake, of phones being discreetly positioned to capture whatever was about to happen. The piano sat on its raised platform like a throne, magnificent and terrible. As Lena approached it, the scent of lemon oil and expensive wood filled her nostrils, so different from the smell of unwashed bodies and industrial disinfectant that had become her normal. She slipped off her outer 2 jackets, leaving just one thin layer between her and the room's judgment. Her fingerless gloves stayed on. The piano bench was real leather, butter-soft and still warm from whoever had last sat there. Probably some hired pianist who played tasteful background music while wealthy people discussed their stock portfolios over duck confit. Lena positioned herself at the keys, her hands hovering over them without touching. The muscle memory was still there. She could feel it humming in her tendons, whispering through her bones. But it had been so long. Not since the conservatory, not since before. "Anytime you're ready," Graham called out, and there was laughter in his voice. He'd already won, as far as he was concerned. The outcome was predetermined. Lena closed her eyes and let herself remember. The practice rooms at Manhattan Conservatory, where she'd spent 6 hours a day minimum, her fingers flying across keys until they bled, and then continuing anyway because Professor Chen said she had a gift, said she could be something extraordinary if she was willing to pay the price. Her mother sitting in the audience at her first recital, tears streaming down her face as 14-year-old Lena made it through Rachmaninoff without a single mistake. Her father driving her to lessons in Brooklyn every Saturday for 3 years, never complaining about the traffic or the parking or the cost, just sitting in the waiting room with his newspaper and his terrible coffee, always ready with a hug when she emerged frustrated or elated or both. The letter from Professor Chen that had arrived 1 week after the accident, after the double funeral, after Lena's entire world had burned down to ash. We at the conservatory extend our deepest sympathies for your loss. However, we must inform you that due to your recent absences and missed tuition payments, we cannot hold your scholarship position. Is she going to play or just sit there? Someone muttered loud enough to Carrie. Lena opened her eyes. What would you like to hear? Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Graham leaned back in his chair, visibly delighted by the question. Oh, I think that should be your choice. Play whatever you think will earn you that meal. Choose wisely. Lena's mind raced through possibilities. She could play something safe, something pretty but unchallenging, a simple Mozart sonata maybe, or one of the easier Chopin nocturnes, something that would prove basic competence while avoiding the risk of spectacular failure. But as her fingers settled onto the keys, feeling their familiar weight and resistance, something shifted in her chest. A spark of the old Lena, the one who'd walked into auditions like she owned them, who'd faced down pieces that made other students quit, who'd actually believed, that she could be great. If she was going to do this, if she was going to turn her struggle into spectacle for these people's entertainment, then she was going to make them actually hear her. Chopin, she said, loud enough for the room to hear. Etude Op. 25, number 11, Winter Wind. The sharp intake of breath came from a man in his 70s sitting alone near the window, someone Lena hadn't noticed before. He set down his fork carefully, his full attention now on her. Graham, however, just looked amused. Bold choice. I look forward to hearing your interpretation. He had no idea what he'd just agreed to witness. Most people didn't. They heard Chopin and thought of pretty nocturnes and waltzes, pleasant background music for sophisticated dinners. Winter Wind was not that. It was 3 minutes and 40 seconds of controlled chaos, of technical demands that separated conservatory students from street pianists, of artistic interpretation that required not just fingers, but soul. The piece opened with a simple, haunting melody in the left hand, deceptively calm, almost fragile. But then the right hand entered with runs that resembled wind tearing through bare branches, relentless and wild, and absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. It was the piece she'd been preparing for her final conservatory recital, the one that never happened. Lena positioned her hands and, for just a moment, sent up a silent thought to her mother, to her father, to the version of herself who'd died with them. Then she played. The opening melody emerged soft and clear, each note precisely placed, the left hand sketching a landscape of winter desolation. 4 measures of introduction, and then her right hand came crashing in like a storm breaking. The runs were exactly as brutal as she remembered, 16th notes cascading in chromatic patterns that required absolute precision at a tempo that allowed no mercy. But her fingers remembered. God, they remembered. The muscle memory that had been built through thousands of hours of practice came flooding back, and suddenly she wasn't in this restaurant being humiliated for sport. She was in the practice room at Manhattan Conservatory, Professor Chen standing behind her saying, "More. I need to hear the fury underneath the beauty. This isn't just wind, it's everything winter takes from us." She was in the tiny apartment in Queens, her mother making dinner while her father pretended to read but actually listened to every note, both of them holding their breath during the difficult passages. She was everywhere she'd ever played this piece, all those versions of herself collapsing into this single moment. The room had gone completely silent except for the piano. Conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Silverware no longer clinked against china. Even the kitchen sounds seemed to have ceased, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Lena drove through the challenging middle section, where the hands crossed repeatedly, where the technical demands intensified into something almost inhuman. Her right hand flew across the upper registers, while her left maintained the steady, melancholic melody underneath. 2 completely separate musical ideas that somehow, impossibly, belonged together. She was vaguely aware of movement in the room, people standing, moving closer, phones being lifted higher to capture better angles. But it was distant, peripheral, unimportant. All that mattered was the music. The piece built toward its climactic section, where the runs became even more ferocious. where the dynamic range pushed the piano to its limits. This was where amateurs fell apart, where technique gave way to noise, where the interpretation either crystallized or collapsed. Lena leaned into it, let the music possess her completely. She wasn't playing notes anymore. She was channeling something elemental. Every ounce of pain from the last 8 months, every moment of hunger and fear and humiliation, every memory of what she'd lost and who she'd been, all of it poured through her fingers into Chopin's unforgiving score. The Steinway responded magnificently, its rich tone filling the restaurant with sound that demanded to be felt as much as heard. This was why you paid $200,000 for an instrument, not for decoration, but for moments exactly like this, when the music transcended performance and became revelation. The final section arrived almost too quickly, the return to the opening melody, but transformed now, darkened by everything that had come before. Lena's left hand sang out the theme while her right continued its relentless wind patterns, softer now, but no less insistent. The piece ended the way winter ends, not with fanfare, but with a simple, quiet resignation. 3 final chords, each one a goodbye, and then silence. Lena's hands remained on the keys for a moment, her chest heaving, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion and the emotional release of playing something she'd buried for so long. The silence stretched and stretched. She finally looked up, her vision blurry with tears she hadn't realized she was crying, and saw the restaurant transformed. People had risen from their tables. A woman near the bar had her hands pressed to her mouth. The elderly man by the window had tears streaming down his face. Then the applause started. It didn't begin politely or slowly. It erupted like thunder, sudden and overwhelming. People weren't just clapping, they were on their feet, some of them shouting. The sound crashed over Lena in waves, and she sat frozen at the piano bench, completely unprepared for this response. "Brava!" someone called out, and others took up the cry. "Brava! Brava!" Lena's eyes found Graham Kingsley, still seated at his table. His expression had undergone a complete transformation. The smug amusement was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He wasn't clapping. The elderly man by the window was making his way through the standing crowd, moving with purpose despite his obvious age. When he reached the piano, he extended his hand to Lena with old-world courtesy. "Dr. Malcolm Avery," he said, his voice carrying a British accent softened by decades in America. "I taught at Juilliard for 40 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've heard Winter Wind played with that level of technical mastery and emotional depth. You, my dear, are the real thing." Lena stared at his outstretched hand, unable to process what was happening. Dr. Malcolm Avery was a legend. She'd read his books, studied his interpretations, knew the names of his famous students the way other people knew movie stars. She stood shakily and accepted his handshake, aware that her palm was probably clammy and rough against his. Thank you. I'm not. You most certainly are," he said firmly, then turned to address the room, his voice cutting through the continued applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed was not a performance, it was a masterclass. This young woman has conservatory-level training and interpretive gifts that cannot be taught." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before landing squarely on Graham, which makes the circumstances that brought her to this piano absolutely shameful. The applause faltered and died. The atmosphere in the room shifted, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Graham stood slowly, his face flushing. "Now see here, Malcolm." "No, Graham, you see here." Dr. Avery's polite demeanor hardened into something formidable. "You set this young woman up for humiliation. You offered food, basic human sustenance, as a prize in a game designed for your amusement. You wanted a spectacle, and you got one. But not the one you planned." Phones that had been recording Lena's performance now swiveled toward the confrontation. Several people were typing frantically, undoubtedly sharing what was unfolding to social media in real time. "I was simply offering an opportunity," Graham began. "You were being cruel," a woman's voice interrupted. She was perhaps 40, dressed in a designer suit, holding her phone up clearly. "And about 1 million people are going to see exactly how cruel when I post this video. That performance was extraordinary, and you tried to turn it into a circus." The girl agreed to the terms, Graham protested, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. He could see the room turning against him, could feel control of the situation slipping away. The starving person accepted crumbs from the king's table, yes, Dr. Avery said coldly. How magnanimous of you to offer them. Tell me, Graham, when's the last time you missed a meal? When's the last time you had to prove your worth for basic dignity? Lena stood beside the piano, overwhelmed by the rapid escalation. Part of her wanted to intervene, to de-escalate, to make herself small again. But another part, the part that had just played Chopin like she was fighting for her life, stayed silent and let it happen. This is ridiculous, Graham snapped. I run a business, not a charity. If she's as talented as you claim, Malcolm, then she should be employed somewhere proper, not wandering into hotels begging for scraps. And yet here she is, Dr. Avery replied, which suggests that perhaps our systems for identifying and supporting talent are catastrophically broken. How many other gifted individuals are sleeping in shelters right now because they lack the safety net that wealth provides? How much brilliance are we losing because people like you see desperation as entertainment rather than tragedy? The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch, clustering in the doorway with wide eyes. I want to know your story, a new voice said. A young man with an expensive camera and press credentials hanging around his neck stepped forward. Not for gossip, for a real piece. How does someone with your level of skill end up homeless in Manhattan? What happened? Lena's throat tightened. The question she'd been dreading, the one she'd spent 8 months avoiding whenever shelter intake staff or social workers asked. She started, then stopped. I can't. I'm sorry. She doesn't owe anyone her trauma, a woman near the bar said firmly. The performance speaks for itself. But Lena was tired. So desperately tired. Tired of carrying it alone, tired of the weight of 8 months of silence, tired of pretending the past hadn't existed. My parents died, she heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. Car accident. 8 months ago. They were on their way to my recital at Manhattan Conservatory. I had a full scholarship there, piano performance major. The words were coming faster now, pushed by pressure that had been building for months. After they died, I couldn't go back. Couldn't play, couldn't do anything. Missed too many classes, missed the tuition insurance deadline because I didn't know it existed. Lost the scholarship, lost the apartment because it was in their names and I was only 18 and didn't know how any of it worked. She was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe the tears away. Social services tried to help, but I turned 19 and aged out of most programs. No family, no job history, no references. Shelters were full most nights. I've been living in subway stations and parks, eating from trash cans, and every single day I told myself tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow, I'd figure it out. Tomorrow, I'd find a way back. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more painful. And then I walked in here, Lena continued, looking directly at Graham now, because I was so hungry I couldn't think straight anymore. And you saw someone you could use, someone desperate enough to dance for your entertainment. Graham's face had gone pale. Around the restaurant, people were openly crying. The woman with the designer suit was typing furiously on her phone, tears streaming down her own face. I'll play for my meal, Lena said, her voice hardening. That was the deal. But I want everyone here to understand what they just saw. You didn't watch a homeless girl get lucky. You watched a trained musician fight her way back from hell. There's a difference. Dr. Avery stepped closer, his hand gentle on her shoulder. My dear, you will have more than a meal. I give you my word. This city will know your name and your story, and doors that were closed will open. The first door that's opening is mine, the woman in the designer suit announced, lowering her phone. I'm Sarah Chen, Artistic Director at the Manhattan Arts Foundation. We have emergency support grants for exactly this kind of situation, artists in crisis who need immediate assistance. Consider yourself approved as of right now. And I want to write this story properly, the journalist added, not the trauma porn version. The real story about how our society fails talented young people and then acts surprised when they disappear. More voices joined in, offers of help cascading from every corner of the restaurant. A woman offered her guest room. A man who owned a piano studio offered practice space. Someone else mentioned job opportunities at a music school in Brooklyn. Graham Kingsley remained standing at his table, his three lunch companions carefully avoiding eye contact with him. His phone buzzed insistently, probably notifications from whatever was being said about this moment on social media. "I think," he said carefully, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated, "that we can arrange for significantly more than the chef's tasting menu. Lena, I apologize if my test seemed inappropriate. I was simply trying to—" "Don't," Lena interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "Don't pretend this was anything other than what it was. You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to prove that I didn't belong in your world. And you were right, in a way. I don't belong in a world where people's suffering is a game." She turned to Dr. Avery, to Sarah Chen, to the journalist, to all the faces now looking at her with respect instead of pity or contempt. "But maybe I belong in a different world. One I can help build." The afternoon light slanted through the restaurant's windows, catching the tears on Lena's face and making them shine like diamonds. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the small miracle that had just occurred within the Meridian Grand's walls. But inside, something had shifted. A story was being born, one that would spread far beyond this room, carried by the dozens of phones that had captured every moment. A story about talent hiding in plain sight, about cruelty exposed, about the difference between charity and justice. And at the center of it all sat a 19-year-old girl in fingerless gloves, her hands still trembling from Chopin, her heart still racing from the terrifying act of being seen. The music had saved her, but what came next would be up to her to compose. The kitchen of luminescence erupted into controlled chaos the moment Chef Anton Beaumont received word that the girl from the piano was coming back for the meal she'd earned. He barked orders in rapid-fire French, while his sous chef scrambled to prepare what would become the most scrutinized tasting menu in the restaurant's history. Lena sat at a corner table that Dr. Avery had commandeered, as far from Graham Kingsley's party as the dining room allowed. Sarah Chen occupied the seat across from her, already making calls and taking notes with the efficiency of someone who'd built a career on turning chaos into opportunity. The journalist, Marcus Webb from the Manhattan Arts Review, sat nearby, his recorder running but his questions gentle, feeling out boundaries rather than pushing through them. "I need you to understand something," Sarah said, ending her third call in as many minutes. "What just happened? What's happening right now? It's going to move fast. The video of your performance is already trending. Over 200,000 views in the last 20 minutes, and that's just from the accounts I can track." Lena's hands trembled as she reached for the water glass in front of her. 200,000 people. The number felt abstract, impossible. 8 hours ago she'd been invisible, just another face in the endless stream of New York's forgotten. Now strangers across the city, across the world, were watching her play Chopin in her threadbare jacket and fingerless gloves. "I don't know if I can handle that," she admitted quietly. "You don't have to handle it alone," Dr. Avery said. He'd positioned himself at the table like a guardian, his presence radiating the kind of authority that made people think twice about approaching. "I've seen this before. Talented young musicians thrust into spotlight they never sought. The key is building the right support structure before the pressure becomes overwhelming." "Which is where I come in," Sarah added. "The Manhattan Arts Foundation exists specifically for situations like this. We have emergency housing partnerships, mental health resources, legal aid for navigating contracts, and media requests. You won't have to figure this out by yourself." A server appeared with the first course, a delicate amuse-bouche of seared scallop with citrus foam that looked more like art than food. Lena stared at it, momentarily paralyzed. She'd spent the last 8 months eating food that came from dumpsters behind restaurants, stale bagels from shelter breakfast lines, whatever she could scavenge or afford with the occasional dollar someone dropped in her path. The idea of eating something this beautiful felt almost sacrilegious. "It's okay to enjoy it," Dr. Avery said gently, reading her hesitation. "You've earned this meal 100 times over." Lena picked up her fork with shaking hands. The scallop melted on her tongue, flavors exploding across her palate with an intensity that made her eyes water. It wasn't just the food, it was what it represented. Being served instead of serving herself from trash. Sitting at a table instead of hiding in doorways. being treated like a person instead of a problem. She had to set down her fork and press her napkin to her face, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. "Take your time," Sarah said softly. "There's no rush." But even as she said it, Lena could see the activity swirling around them. More phones pointed their direction, though most people were being discreet about it. The hostess Michelle fielded a constant stream of questions from people trying to enter the restaurant, word having spread that something extraordinary was unfolding inside. Through the windows, Lena spotted a news van pulling up to the curb. "How do I make this stop?" she whispered. "You don't," Marcus said, not unkindly. "The story is out there now. What you can control is how it's told. You can let other people define your narrative, or you can participate in shaping it." "I'm not a story," Lena said, a flash of anger cutting through her overwhelm. "I'm a person who's been through hell and just wants to survive." Exactly, Marcus replied. "And that's the story that matters. Not homeless girl plays piano for food. That's the headline people will write if you stay silent. But talented musician reveals broken system that destroys young artists. That's the story that could actually change things." The second course arrived. A soup so artfully presented it seemed wrong to disturb it. Lena forced herself to eat, her body remembering hunger even as her mind reeled. Across the restaurant, Graham Kingsley's table had emptied. His lunch companions had made quiet exits, leaving him alone with his phone and what was undoubtedly a flood of damage control messages. Lena watched him signal for his check, his movements stiff and self-conscious under the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. Dr. Avery followed her gaze. "He's finished in certain circles," he said matter-of-factly. "The story is already framing him as the villain who tried to humiliate a homeless prodigy. Fair or not, that's the narrative that's taking hold." "Is it unfair?" Sarah asked pointedly. "He literally made her perform for food like a trained animal." "He gave me a choice," Lena said quietly. "I could have walked away." "A choice between humiliation and starvation isn't really a choice," Marcus countered. "That's the whole point. People in power love to talk about choices and meritocracy, while ignoring that desperation makes free will a luxury." Lena set down her spoon, the soup suddenly sitting heavy in her stomach. "I don't want to be a symbol. I don't want to be the poster child for anything. I just want my life back." "Then let's focus on that, Doctor," Avery said firmly. "What does getting your life back look like?" The question hung in the air while servers brought the third course. Lena stared at the perfectly arranged lamb medallions and roasted vegetables, trying to organize thoughts that felt like scattered sheet music. "I want to play again," she finally said. "Not like today. Not because I'm desperate or because someone's testing me. I want to play because it's what I was meant to do. Before my parents died, I had a plan: finish conservatory, compete in the international Chopin competition in Warsaw, build a performance career." Her voice cracked. "I want that life back. The one where music was joy instead of survival." Sarah was already typing notes. "The Arts Foundation can help with that. We have partnerships with every major conservatory in the tri-state area. Manhattan Conservatory dropped you for administrative reasons during a trauma. That's exactly the kind of institutional failure we're designed to address." "I can make calls to the administration there," Dr. Avery added. "Your previous scholarship was revoked due to circumstances completely beyond your control. Any reasonable review would reinstate it." "But what if I'm not good enough anymore?" The fear that had been lurking beneath everything else finally surfaced. "I haven't had regular practice access in 8 months. My technique is probably shot. Other students have been working while I've been—" "You just played Winter Wind flawlessly after 8 months without practice," Dr. Avery interrupted. "Do you understand how extraordinary that is? Most conservatory students can't nail that piece with daily practice. You did it cold, under immense pressure, while starving and exhausted." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Lena, you're not good enough. You're exceptional. What you need isn't to catch up. You need support to reach the level you're capable of achieving." The fourth course arrived, then the fifth. Lena ate mechanically, her body grateful even as her mind churned. Around them, the restaurant had settled into a strange new rhythm. People were still watching, but more subtly now, respecting an invisible boundary that Dr. Avery's presence seemed to enforce. The servers treated her with careful kindness, each course delivered with quiet encouragement. Her phone, a cracked prepaid smartphone she'd managed to hold onto through everything, buzzed insistently in her jacket pocket. She'd turned it off weeks ago to save the remaining battery, only powering it on when absolutely necessary. Now she pulled it out and stared at the flood of notifications. Friend requests from people she didn't know, messages from news outlets requesting interviews, comments on videos she hadn't even known existed. Her name was trending on Twitter, accompanied by hashtags like #PianoGirl and #WinterWind and #Graham Kingsley cancelled. "This is insane," she whispered, scrolling through messages that ranged from supportive to exploitative to outright cruel. Someone had already dug up her parents' obituary and posted it. Another account claimed to have found photos from her conservatory days, spreading them without permission. "Give me that," Sarah said gently but firmly, taking the phone from Lena's shaking hands. Lesson 1 of sudden fame. You don't read the comments yourself. Not yet. Let someone else filter the noise first. "I didn't ask for this." "No one ever does," Marcus said. "But since it's happening anyway, we can at least try to steer it towards something meaningful. I want to write a piece for the review, not a puff piece, a real investigation into how many talented young artists we're losing to poverty and systemic failures. But I need your permission to center it around your story." "What would that mean?" "An interview, a few hours, maybe spread over a couple of days so you're not overwhelmed. I'd want to talk about your training, your parents, what happened after you lost them, how the system failed you at every turn, the conservatory, social services, the shelter system, and then I'd want to document your path forward, whatever that looks like." Lena's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of exposing that much pain to strangers felt impossible. But she looked around the restaurant, at the faces still watching, at the phones still recording, at the news van outside, and realized the exposure was happening whether she participated or not. "If I say no, people will write about me anyway, won't they?" "Yes," Marcus admitted. "And most of it will be garbage, clickbait headlines and manufactured outrage. At least this way, the real story gets told properly." The sixth course arrived, a delicate fish preparation that Lena barely tasted. Her mind was already miles away, racing through implications and possibilities and fears she couldn't quite articulate. Sarah's phone rang, and she stepped away from the table to take the call. When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested significant news. "That was the executive director of the Steinway Society," she said. "They're offering you full access to their practice facilities, effective immediately. 24/7 keycard, any piano you want. They saw the video and want to support your comeback." Lena's breath caught. The Steinway Society maintained some of the finest practice spaces in Manhattan, used by professional pianists and competition winners. The idea of having unlimited access to that level of instrument felt like a dream. Why would they do that? "Because what you played today reminded people why music matters," Dr. Avery said. "Because your story is resonating with people who felt overlooked or dismissed. Because sometimes the world actually does rally around someone who deserves it." The seventh and final course appeared, a sophisticated dessert that looked too beautiful to eat. Lena stared at it, feeling the weight of 7 courses settle into her stomach, along with the weight of 7 months of starvation suddenly ending. Her body didn't quite know how to process the abundance. "I need some air," she said abruptly, standing on legs that felt unsteady. Sarah and Dr. Avery both moved to follow, but she held up a hand. "Just a minute, please. I just need a minute alone." The restaurant's bathroom was mercifully empty, all marble and gold fixtures and soft lighting that made everything look ethereal. Lena gripped the edge of the sink and stared at her reflection. The girl looking back at her was a stranger, eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles, cheeks hollowed by weight loss, hair that needed cutting, skin that needed care, the visible markers of 8 months living rough. But beneath the damage, she could still see traces of who she'd been, the determined set of her jaw, the artist's eyes that had learned to see in music what others missed. Her hands gripped the marble harder. These hands had just played Chopin, these same hands that had dug through garbage for food, that had gone numb from sleeping on frozen sidewalks, that had lost calluses and strength from months without practice. They'd still remembered. The bathroom door opened and a woman entered, the one who'd earlier shouted at Graham about posting the video. She met Lena's eyes in the mirror. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said quietly. My daughter is at Berkeley right now, studying violin. We almost had to pull her out last semester because we hit a financial rough patch. Watching you play, watching you stand up to that pompous ass, it reminded me why we're fighting so hard to keep her in school. Art matters. Music matters. You matter. She left before Lena could respond, but the words lingered. You matter. Such simple words. But Lena couldn't remember the last time she'd believed them. When she returned to the table, a new presence had joined their group. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an expensive but understated suit sat next to Sarah, clearly mid-conversation. Lena, this is Christine Vasquez, Sarah said. She's a trauma counselor who specializes in working with artists. I took the liberty of calling her because what you've been through would break most people, and you're going to need support processing it while everything else is happening. I'm not broken, Lena said automatically, defensively. No, you're not, Christine agreed calmly. You're surviving, which is remarkable. But survival and healing are different things. What you experienced, losing your parents, losing your identity as a student and artist, months of homelessness and hunger, that's profound trauma. And now you're being thrust into a very public spotlight before you've had time to process any of it. That's a recipe for a breakdown if we're not careful. Lena sank into her chair, feeling the truth of Christine's words in her bones. The adrenaline from the performance was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. I don't know how to do this. That's okay, Christine said gently. You don't have to know. That's what the support structure is for. Sarah can handle the practical logistics. Dr. Avery can guide your musical development. Marcus can manage the media narrative. And I can help you process the emotional weight of all of it. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. The word anymore hit Lena like a physical force. For 8 months, alone had been her default state. Sleeping alone in doorways and subway cars. Eating alone wherever she could scavenge food. Making decisions alone because there was no one to consult. The idea of actually having people in her corner felt foreign and terrifying and desperately needed all at once. I don't have any money to pay you, she said, the practical concern surfacing through her fog of emotion. Any of you. I can't afford. The foundation covers it, Sarah interrupted. That's literally what we exist for. Emergency grants for artists in crisis include mental health support, legal services, temporary housing, everything you need to stabilize. How temporary is temporary? The question came out smaller than Lena intended. Sarah exchanged glances with Dr. Avery before answering. We have a transitional apartment in Morningside Heights. It's yours for 6 months, renewable if needed. Fully furnished, utilities included. Not luxury, but safe and clean, and yours. Lena's vision blurred with tears. An apartment, a door she could lock, a bed that belonged to her. The basic dignities she'd lost 8 months ago, suddenly within reach. I don't understand why you're helping me, she whispered. You don't know me. I could be anyone. You're not anyone, Dr. Avery said firmly. You're a musician of exceptional gift who was betrayed by every system meant to catch people when they fall. You're exactly who we should be helping. Marcus cleared his throat. I hate to add pressure, but there's a small crowd forming outside. Word is spread about what happened, and people want to see you. Some are supporters, some are media. You need to decide how you want to handle that. Through the restaurant windows, Lena could see the gathering crowd. 20 people, maybe 30, some holding phones, others just watching the entrance with expectant faces. The news van's satellite dish was fully extended. What would you do? She asked Marcus. Me? I'd give a very brief statement, something genuine but boundaries clear. Thank people for their support, explain that you need time to process everything, and exit before anyone can corner you with questions. 2 minutes maximum. And if I don't want to talk to anyone? That's also valid, Christine interjected. You don't owe strangers your story or your time. We can arrange for you to leave through the service entrance. No one would blame you for protecting your privacy. Lena looked down at her hands, at the fingerless gloves her mother had given her 3 Christmases ago. She thought about all the people watching the video right now, all the comments and shares and discussions happening about her life. She thought about the woman in the bathroom whose daughter was at Berkeley fighting to stay in school. I'll make a statement, she decided. Just a short one. If people are going to talk about me anyway, they should at least hear my actual voice. Sarah smiled. Okay, let's workshop what you want to say. Keep it simple, from the heart. And remember, you can always say no comment to anything you're not ready to address. They spent the next 20 minutes preparing. Marcus coached her on media basics. Look at the person asking questions, not the cameras. Speak clearly but naturally. It's okay to pause and think before answering. Sarah reminded her that she could end it at any time, that no one had a right to her story beyond what she chose to share. Christine pulled her aside for a quiet moment. How are you really doing, under all of this? Lena considered the question honestly. I feel like I'm in someone else's life. This morning I was trying to figure out how to get through another day. Now I'm being offered apartments and scholarships and practice spaces. It doesn't feel real. It's real, Christine assured her. And the emotional whiplash of going from crisis to opportunity this quickly, that's going to hit you hard, probably soon. When it does, you call me, day or night. Don't try to tough it out alone. Graham Kingsley had long since departed, leaving only his tarnished reputation behind. Lena spotted the restaurant manager speaking urgently with his staff, no doubt dealing with the PR nightmare that was undoubtedly unfolding. She felt a twinge of something that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't satisfaction either. He'd been cruel, yes, but the viral mob that was likely forming against him, that felt like a different kind of cruelty. Ready? Sarah asked, offering her arm like they were heading into battle together. Lena took a deep breath and nodded. The group moved as a unit toward the restaurant entrance, Dr. Avery and Marcus flanking her like protective barriers. The hostess Michelle opened the door with an encouraging smile. The January air hit Lena's face, cold and sharp and real. The crowd pressed forward immediately, phones thrust in her direction, voices overlapping with questions and encouragement and demands for attention. Lena, how does it feel to be famous? Are you going to sue the hotel? What happens next for you? Can you play something else? Marcus stepped forward, his press credentials visible, his voice carrying authority. Ms. Hart will make a brief statement. Please hold your questions until after. The crowd quieted somewhat, though phones remained recording, capturing every angle. Lena looked at the faces watching her, young and old, skeptical and sympathetic, curious and kind. She thought about what she wanted them to know, what actually mattered. My name is Lena Hart, she began, her voice steadier than she expected. 8 months ago, I lost my parents in an accident. I lost my scholarship, my home, and for a while, I lost myself. I've spent the last 8 months surviving, barely, on the streets of this city. Today, I walked into that restaurant desperate enough to accept humiliation in exchange for food. I didn't expect to play Chopin. I didn't expect kindness from strangers. I didn't expect any of this. She paused, gathering her thoughts while cameras captured every expression. I'm grateful for the support I'm receiving. I'm overwhelmed by how many people have reached out to help. But I also want to say this. I'm not special. There are thousands of people in this city right now who are just as desperate as I was this morning. People with talents and dreams and stories that matter just as much as mine. The only difference is that I got lucky today. I had skills that happen to be visible and valued. Most people don't get that chance. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. So yes, I'm accepting help. I'm going to rebuild my life and my career. But I'm also going to remember that the system that failed me is failing countless others right now. And if having a platform means I can shine a light on that, on them, then maybe something good can come from all of this. She took a step back, signaling the end of her statement, but a reporter pushed forward. Lena, do you blame Graham Kingsley for what happened? Lena considered the question carefully. I think Mr. Kingsley saw an opportunity for entertainment and didn't think about the human cost. I think our society is full of people who do the same thing every day, turning other people's suffering into spectacle, whether it's in a fancy restaurant or through the policies that create homelessness in the first place. She met the reporter's eyes directly. So no, I don't blame one man. I blame a system that made what happened today possible. Another voice called out, What's your message to other young artists struggling right now? Don't give up, Lena said immediately. Even when everything seems impossible, even when the world tells you you're not worth its time, you are. Your art matters. You matter. And sometimes when you least expect it, Someone will see you and remember why beauty and creation and music are worth fighting for. Sarah touched her elbow gently, a signal that it was time to go. Dr. Avery had already positioned himself to clear a path through the crowd. "Thank you all," Lena said as they began moving. "I need time now to process everything. But I'm grateful to every person who watched that video and saw a human being instead of a headline." The crowd parted as they walked toward a car Sarah had arranged, though questions continued to fly. Lena kept her head up, her shoulders back, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She'd played for royalty in her conservatory days, had performed in front of hundreds. But this felt different, more real, more terrifying. The car door closed behind her, muffling the noise of the crowd. She sat between Sarah and Christine, while Dr. Avery took the front seat, giving directions to the driver. As they pulled away from the Meridian Grand, Lena turned to look back at the building where her life had changed. The crowd was already dispersing, the news van preparing to leave, the moment passing into history, and hashtags and think pieces that would be written about it. But for Lena, sitting in a warm car heading toward housing and hope, the moment was still present, still overwhelming, still impossible to fully comprehend. "You did beautifully," Christine said softly. "That statement was perfect." "I feel like I'm going to throw up," Lena admitted. "That's normal," Sarah assured her. "You just went through more emotional intensity in 3 hours than most people experience in a year. Your body is trying to catch up with your circumstances." The car headed north through Manhattan, passing streets that Lena had walked 1,000 times while homeless, now seeing them from inside instead of outside. The shift in perspective felt symbolic somehow, though she was too exhausted to articulate how. Her phone, still in Sarah's possession, continued to buzz with notifications. Somewhere out there, her performance was still spreading, her words still being shared, her story still being written by strangers who would never know the full truth of what she'd survived. But here, in this car, surrounded by people who'd chosen to show up for her, Lena allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in 8 months. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But possibility. The idea that tomorrow might actually be different. That the fight to survive might transform into something else. A chance to actually live. The apartment in Morningside Heights was smaller than Lena remembered apartments being. But after 8 months of measuring her world in doorways and subway benches, it felt like a palace. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting Lena enter first into what would be her home for the next 6 months. Hardwood floors caught the late afternoon light streaming through windows that actually had curtains. A couch sat against one wall, worn but clean, facing a small television that Lena had no intention of turning on anytime soon. The kitchenette was barely large enough for one person, but it had a refrigerator that hummed quietly and a stove with all 4 burners intact. Through a doorway, Lena could see a bedroom with an actual bed, made up with fresh linens that looked impossibly white. She stood in the center of the living room and tried to remember how to exist in a space that was hers. "The bathroom has hot water," Sarah said gently, understanding without being told what Lena was thinking. "Towels in the cabinet, basic toiletries stocked. There's food in the fridge and pantry, nothing fancy, but enough to get you through the next few days. The building has a laundry room in the basement, and here's a card with credits already loaded." Lena took the laundry card with shaking hands, staring at it like it was a foreign object. Clean clothes. She could have clean clothes whenever she wanted them. "I've scheduled a session with Christine for tomorrow afternoon," Sarah continued, setting a folder of paperwork on the small dining table. "No pressure, but she thinks it's important to start processing everything sooner rather than later. Dr. Avery wants to meet the day after to discuss your musical path forward, and Marcus is flexible on timing for the interview, but he'd like to start within the week while the story is still fresh." The list of obligations should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt grounding. Structure, purpose, things to do that weren't just surviving until tomorrow. "The Steinway Society access starts immediately," Sarah added, placing a key card on the table next to the folder. "The practice facility is on West 58th, 24/7 access, like I mentioned. They're requesting that you sign a guest book when you use the spaces, but that's just for their records. No performances required, no obligations beyond treating the instruments with respect." Lena picked up the key card, running her thumb over the embossed logo. Access to world-class pianos whenever she wanted. The gift felt too enormous to accept. Yet here it was, solid and real in her hand. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Any of you. This is what should have happened 8 months ago," Sarah interrupted firmly. "This is the safety net that should exist for everyone, not just the people lucky enough to go viral. You don't need to thank us for doing what's right." After Sarah left, Lena stood alone in the apartment and listened to the silence. Not the threatening silence of dark streets or the chaotic silence of overcrowded shelters, but the peaceful silence of privacy, of safety, of home. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower, watching steam fill the small space. When was the last time she'd had hot water? The YMCA, maybe, back in September, when she'd still had her membership card before it got stolen along with everything else she'd been carrying. 4 months ago. 4 months of cold water in public restrooms, of baby wipes from convenience stores, of the constant awareness of her own smell that no amount of deodorant could fully mask. Lena stripped off her layers, 3 jackets, 2 shirts, jeans that had started the day stiff with dirt and dried sweat. She caught sight of herself in the mirror and flinched. Her ribs were too prominent, her hip bones jutting out at angles that looked painful. Bruises in various stages of healing marked her legs and arms, souvenirs from sleeping on concrete and metal grates. Her hair hung limp and greasy, longer than she'd worn it in years because haircuts were a luxury that didn't make the priority list. She stepped into the shower and let the hot water hit her skin. The first few seconds burned, her body so unaccustomed to warmth that it registered as pain. Then something inside her cracked open and she sank to the floor of the tub, pulling her knees to her chest as 8 months of held-back tears finally broke free. She cried for her parents, killed on their way to watch her perform. She cried for the girl she'd been, confident and talented and so naive about how quickly everything could collapse. She cried for the version of herself who'd spent last night shivering in a subway station, who'd walked into the Meridian Grand this afternoon expecting nothing and receiving everything. She cried until the water ran cold and her body had nothing left, until the grief and relief and terror and hope had wrung her out completely. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that was rough but clean, she felt lighter somehow. Emptied out but not empty. Ready, maybe, to start the work of becoming whole again. The bedroom closet held clothes that Sarah must have arranged. Basic items in approximately Lena's size, tags still attached. Jeans that fit. A sweater that didn't smell like someone else's life. Socks without holes. Lena dressed slowly, marveling at the simple dignity of clean fabric against clean skin. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, still buzzing periodically with notifications she couldn't bring herself to check. The number of messages had climbed into the thousands. Her story had apparently made national news, the video of her performance shared by celebrities and musicians and people with millions of followers. The hashtags had evolved. #LenaHart was trending alongside #WinterWind and #Systemic Failure and #Artists Matter. She powered the phone off completely and set it aside. Tomorrow she could deal with being a symbol, a story, a trending topic. Tonight she just needed to be Lena. The refrigerator held milk, eggs, bread, cheese, fresh fruit that made her mouth water just looking at it. Lena made herself a simple sandwich and ate it standing at the counter, forcing herself to chew slowly, even though her body wanted to devour everything in sight. The 7-course meal from Luminescence had been hours ago, and her stomach was already demanding more, trying to make up for months of deprivation in a single evening. She ate half the sandwich and wrapped the rest for later, knowing from experience that too much food too quickly would make her sick. The apple she'd grabbed sat on the counter, red and perfect, and Lena picked it up just to feel its weight, its smoothness, the simple abundance of having food she could save for tomorrow. Sleep should have come easily. She was exhausted down to her bones, and the bed was softer than anything she'd experienced in months. But when Lena lay down, her mind refused to quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the restaurant, the crowd, the cameras. She heard Chopin's notes echoing in her memory, felt the piano keys under her fingers, relived the moment when the music had poured out of her like water from a broken dam. She thought about Dr. Avery's words. "You're not good enough. You're exceptional." Was she still? Or had today been a fluke, Adrenaline and desperation combining to create something that couldn't be replicated? What if she went to the Steinway Society tomorrow and discovered that her technique had deteriorated beyond repair? What if the conservatory reviewed her case and decided she wasn't worth the second chance? What if everyone's faith in her was misplaced? The thoughts spiraled until Lena couldn't stand lying down anymore. She got up and paced the small apartment, her body too wired for rest. The keycard from the Steinway Society sat on the table, catching light from the street lamps outside. It was nearly midnight. The practice facility was available 24/7. She could go. Right now. Test herself in private before facing anyone's expectations. The idea terrified her almost as much as it compelled her. Lena dressed in her new clothes, grabbed the keycard, and headed into the night. The subway was nearly empty at this hour, just scattered late-shift workers and night owls heading home or out. She caught herself checking exits and blind spots, habits from months of staying vigilant against the dangers that multiplied after dark. But she wasn't homeless anymore, wasn't prey. The shift in status felt surreal. The Steinway Society building on West 58th was an elegant brownstone that managed to project both history and precision. Lena stood outside for a full minute before working up the courage to use her keycard. The door clicked open smoothly, and she stepped into a hushed lobby that smelled of wood polish and old money. A security guard looked up from his desk, and Lena's first instinct was to apologize for existing, to explain herself, to justify her presence. But he simply smiled and gestured to the sign-in book. "You must be Ms. Hart," he said warmly. "They told us to expect you. The practice rooms are on the second and third floors. Take whichever one calls to you, they're all open." Lena signed her name with a hand that trembled slightly, then climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched before her, doors on either side labeled with room numbers. Through the first door's window, she could see a Steinway Grand, its surface gleaming under soft lighting. She chose the room at the end of the hall, smaller than some of the others, but with windows that looked out over the street. The piano inside was a Model B, not quite as massive as the concert grand she'd played at Luminescence, but still a professional instrument worth more than most people's cars. Lena sat at the bench and stared at the keys without touching them. Her fingerless gloves were gone. She'd left them at the apartment, feeling somehow that this moment required her bare hands. The calluses she'd built up through years of practice had softened over months of disuse. Her fingers looked pale and thin in the room's gentle light. She placed her hands on the keys and played a single C major scale. Slowly at first, testing the action, the touch, the response. The piano was perfectly tuned, the tone rich and warm. Her fingers remembered the pattern, the spacing, the small adjustments required to produce even sound across the octaves. She played the scale again, faster this time, then in contrary motion, then in thirds, in sixths, the exercises that had once been her daily routine flooding back into her muscle memory. The technical work felt good, grounding, a return to fundamentals that required no interpretation or emotional vulnerability, just mechanics, just muscle and nerve and trained response. But after 20 minutes of scales and arpeggios, Lena knew she was stalling. The real test wasn't whether her fingers could move. Today at Luminescence had proven they could. The real test was whether she could still access the artistry, the emotional depth, the thing that separated competent playing from compelling performance. She thought about what to play. What piece would tell her the truth about where she stood? Not Chopin. She'd wrung everything out of herself with Winter Wind, and wasn't ready to return to that emotional landscape. Not Rachmaninoff, which was too tied to memories of her mother crying in the audience. Not Beethoven, which her father had loved. Debussy. Clair de Lune. A piece about moonlight and memory, about beauty tinged with melancholy. A piece that required technical control but also demanded emotional honesty. Lena began to play, and within the first few measures, she knew. The music was still there, changed perhaps, darker now, weighted with experiences that the conservatory version of herself could never have imagined, but still present, still true. The notes floated through the practice room, each phrase a small act of recovery. Her hands knew this music the way they knew how to breathe, the pattern so deeply embedded that 8 months of deprivation couldn't erase them. But what emerged from the piano was different from any previous performance of this piece. Less innocent, More, hard won. She played through to the end, letting the final notes fade into silence before lifting her hands from the keys. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear, from recognition. She was still a musician, still an artist. The core of who she'd been had survived. Lena stayed at the Steinway Society until nearly 3 a.m, working through pieces from her old repertoire and discovering which ones still fit and which ones would need to be relearned with her new understanding. She played Schubert and found unexpected tenderness. She played Bach and discovered architecture in the counterpoint she'd never noticed before. She attempted Liszt and realized her technique, while still solid, needed serious work to tackle the most demanding passages. By the time she walked back to the apartment, exhausted but settled in a way she hadn't felt in months, the sky was beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. She fell into bed without bothering to undress and slept dreamlessly for 6 hours straight. The session with Christine Vasquez the next afternoon took place in a small office in Midtown that managed to feel both professional and comforting. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a box of tissues positioned discreetly within reach. "I want to start by acknowledging how overwhelming the last 36 hours must have been," Christine said once they'd settled in. "Most people need weeks or months to process the kind of trauma you've experienced. You've had less than 2 days, and you're being asked to navigate sudden fame on top of it. How are you holding up?" Lena considered the question honestly. "I don't know. I feel like I'm watching everything happen to someone else, like I'm going to wake up and still be on the street, and this will all have been a dream." That's a very normal response to rapid change, especially after prolonged trauma. Your brain is trying to protect you from whiplash by maintaining some emotional distance. But that distance can't last forever, and when it fades, you're going to feel the full weight of everything at once. "I cried in the shower last night," Lena admitted, "for hours." "Is that what you mean?" "That's part of it," Christine confirmed, "but there will be more. Grief has a way of coming in waves, especially when we're finally safe enough to feel it. You spent 8 months in survival mode, where processing emotions was a luxury you couldn't afford. Now that you have safety and stability, your psyche is going to start demanding that you actually deal with what you've been through." They talked for over an hour, Christine gently guiding Lena through an assessment of her mental state and establishing baseline support. They discussed triggers, crowds, certain smells, the sound of police sirens that reminded her of the night her parents died. They talked about nightmares, which Lena had been having regularly but had never had the luxury of addressing. They established a plan for ongoing sessions, twice weekly for now, with the understanding that the frequency could increase if needed. "I want to circle back to something you said in your statement yesterday," Christine said toward the end of their session. "You talked about not being special, about how others deserve help just as much as you do. That's true. And it speaks to your empathy and awareness. But I need you to also understand that you deserve this help regardless of whether others are also getting it. Your worth isn't comparative." Lena felt tears prick her eyes. "I keep waiting for someone to realize they made a mistake, to say, actually, we meant to help someone else, not you." That's the trauma talking. The experience of having every system fail you simultaneously created a belief that you're not worth helping. We're going to work on challenging that belief, but it won't happen overnight. For now, I just need you to accept that you're allowed to receive help without earning it through suffering or exceptional talent. The meeting with Dr. Avery the following day had a completely different energy. They met at a small cafe near Lincoln Center, and the elderly professor arrived with a leather portfolio stuffed with papers and a gleam in his eye that suggested plans already in motion. "I've made some calls," he said without preamble, sliding a cup of coffee across the table to Lena. "Manhattan Conservatory is prepared to reinstate your scholarship, effective immediately. They're calling it administrative clemency due to extenuating circumstances, which is bureaucratic speak for, we're terrified of the PR nightmare if we don't fix this." Lena's hands wrapped around the coffee cup, seeking its warmth. "They want me back?" "They're begging you back," Dr. Avery corrected with obvious satisfaction. "Your former professor, Chen, has been raising hell in faculty meetings, apparently. She never wanted you dropped in the first place, but was overruled by administration. Now that same administration is falling over themselves to make it right." "When would I start?" "That's up to you. The spring semester is already underway, but they're willing to create an independent study track for you this semester. Private lessons, self-directed practice, no performance requirements until you're ready. Then you'd rejoin the full program in the fall. It was more than Lena had dared to hope for. A path back to the life she'd lost, handed to her with apologies and accommodations. But something in her gut twisted uncomfortably. "What's wrong?" Dr. Avery asked, reading her hesitation. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" "I don't know," Lena admitted. 2 days ago, it was everything I wanted. But now I don't know if I can just go back to being a conservatory student. Pretending the last 8 months didn't happen. Sitting in theory classes with people who've never missed a meal. Dr. Avery nodded slowly. "That's a valid concern. You've changed. The question is whether the conservatory program can accommodate who you are now, not just who you were before." "Can it? Honestly? Probably not without some creative adaptation, which is why I have a different proposal to consider." He pulled papers from his portfolio. "There's a fellowship program through the New York Philharmonic for emerging artists. It's designed for musicians who are beyond conservatory level but not yet established professionals. Full stipend, private coaching with principal players, performance opportunities, but also flexibility to pursue your own artistic vision. Applications aren't usually due until fall, but I spoke with the director. He watched your video. He's willing to fast-track an application if you're interested." Lena scanned the papers, her mind racing. A fellowship would mean recognition as a professional, not a student. It would mean being treated as an artist in her own right, not someone who needed to prove herself in classrooms and juries. "What would you recommend?" she asked. Dr. Avery smiled. "I think you already know what you want. You're just afraid to claim it because it feels too big, too ambitious for someone who was homeless 2 days ago. But Lena, you're not that girl anymore. You're the musician who played Winter Wind in front of millions. You're the artist who stood up and gave that statement about systemic failure. Conservatory is safe. The fellowship is the leap." "I'm terrified of leaping." "Good. That means you're taking it seriously." He leaned forward. "Here's what I suggest. Keep the conservatory reinstatement as a backup option. Apply for the fellowship. See what happens. If you get it, you make a choice. If you don't, you have the conservatory waiting. Either way, you're moving forward." The conversation shifted to practical matters. Repertoire she should prepare, performances she should attend, connections Dr. Avery could facilitate. By the time they parted ways, Lena had a concrete plan for the next 3 months, and a growing sense that her musical future might be larger than she'd allowed herself to imagine. Marcus Webb's interview began that evening and stretched across 3 sessions over the following days. He approached it like investigative journalism, not puff-piece entertainment, digging into the specific failures that had led to Lena's situation. "Walk me through the conservatory's response to your parents' death," he prompted during their first session, his recorder running between them. "What kind of support did they offer?" "They sent a card," Lena said flatly. "A generic sympathy card signed by the dean, and then 2 weeks later, a letter saying I'd missed the deadline for tuition insurance and my scholarship was being revoked due to excessive absences." "Did anyone call you, visit, offer counseling resources?" "No, Professor Chen tried, I think. She left messages, but I wasn't answering my phone. Lena's voice cracked. "I was barely functional. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, definitely couldn't practice. The idea of sitting at a piano when my parents had died on their way to hear me play, I couldn't do it." Marcus took careful notes. "And social services? What happened when you reached out to them?" "I didn't know I was supposed to reach out. I was 18, technically an adult, and I didn't know about the resources that existed. By the time someone from victim services contacted me, I'd already been evicted from the apartment. They found me a shelter bed, but only for 30 days, and only if I could get there before 6 p.m. when they locked admissions. I had no job, no income, no way to meet that deadline consistently. The interview process was brutal, forcing Lena to articulate failures she'd internalized as personal shortcomings. But Marcus's questions revealed the pattern. A young person in crisis encountering system after system designed for different circumstances, each one failing in a slightly different way until she fell through all the cracks simultaneously. The video of your performance has been viewed over 50 million times now, Marcus said during their final session. The response has been overwhelming, but there's also been criticism, people saying you should have asked for help sooner, or that you must have made bad choices to end up homeless. How do you respond to that? Lena had been preparing for this question, knowing it would come eventually. I think people who say things like that have never experienced how quickly the world can collapse around you. My parents died on a Tuesday. By Friday, I'd missed the insurance deadline that could have saved my scholarship because I didn't know it existed. By the following month, I'd lost my housing because I didn't know tenant laws or what resources were available. I was 18 years old, traumatized, and completely alone. I didn't make bad choices. I just didn't know what choices I had. And now that you do have choices, now I'm trying to make sure other people know their choices too, Lena said. That's why I'm doing this interview. Not for sympathy or to relive my trauma, but because if my story can help one person navigate their crisis better than I navigated mine, then maybe something good comes from all of it. By the end of her first week in the apartment, Lena had established a routine that felt almost normal. Mornings at the Steinway Society, rebuilding her technique piece by piece. Afternoons for therapy, interviews, or meetings with the growing team of people invested in her success. Evenings for rest, though sleep remained elusive more often than not. The fellowship application consumed her attention as the deadline approached. She recorded audition pieces at the Steinway Society, Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata, Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, and inevitably, Chopin's Winter Wind, though playing it in an empty practice room felt hollow compared to the raw emotion of the restaurant performance. Sarah checked in daily, managing the practical aspects of Lena's new life with extraordinary efficiency. Job offers had started coming in, requests for performances, teaching positions, even a reality show pitch that Sarah had immediately declined on Lena's behalf. You're going to need to make some decisions soon about how you want to navigate all of this attention, Sarah said during one of their meetings. The initial viral wave will fade, but you're building a sustainable public profile now. That requires strategy. I don't want to be famous, Lena protested. I just want to play piano. I understand that, but whether you want it or not, you have a platform now. The question is what you do with it. Sarah pulled out her tablet, showing Lena the analytics. Your statement outside the restaurant has been quoted by homeless advocacy groups, arts funding organizations, social service reformers. You've become a symbol for systemic change, whether you intended to or not. Lena stared at the numbers, shares, retweets, articles written, fundraisers started in her name for homeless musicians. The responsibility felt crushing. What if I'm not strong enough for this, she whispered. Then you take it one day at a time, Sarah replied gently. You don't have to change the world, Lena. You just have to keep showing up as yourself. The rest will follow. That night, alone in her apartment, Lena stood at the window and looked out over Morningside Heights. Lights flickered in windows where people were living their lives, cooking dinner, watching television, having conversations with loved ones who hadn't been taken from them without warning. She thought about the shelter she'd slept in 2 weeks ago, wondered who was occupying her usual corner now. She thought about the subway grate that had kept her warm on the coldest nights, about the 24-hour diner where sympathetic waitresses had occasionally slipped her free coffee. She thought about all the people still out there fighting battles just as desperate as hers had been, without the lucky break of a viral video to save them. And she understood, with sudden clarity, that Sarah was right. She had a platform now, a voice that people were listening to. And while she couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix every broken system, she could at least bear witness, could make sure that when people saw her success, they also saw the failures that had preceded it. Lena pulled out her phone. She'd started checking it again, learning to filter the noise, and opened a fresh note. She began to write, words flowing faster than she could type, ideas crystallizing into something concrete, a foundation. Not just for musicians, though that would be part of it, but for young people in crisis who were falling through the cracks the way she had. Emergency funding for students who lost family members, legal aid for navigating bureaucracies, mental health support, housing assistance, all the things she'd needed and couldn't access because she didn't know they were supposed to exist. It was ambitious. Probably too ambitious for someone who'd been homeless a week ago. But as Lena typed, filling pages with notes and ideas and half-formed plans, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Purpose. The foundation idea consumed Lena's thoughts for days, growing from scattered notes into something resembling an actual plan. She mentioned it cautiously to Sarah during their next meeting, half expecting to be told she was overreaching, that she should focus on her own recovery before trying to help others. Instead, Sarah's eyes lit up with immediate recognition. That's exactly the kind of project that could have real impact. The Manhattan Arts Foundation could serve as a fiscal sponsor while you get it off the ground. We have the infrastructure, the nonprofit status, the administrative experience. You'd provide the vision and the voice. I don't know anything about running a foundation, Lena protested, but even as she said it, she felt the pull of possibility. You know what it's like to fall through every crack in the system. That's more valuable than any business degree. Sarah pulled out her tablet, already making notes. Let's start with a pilot program. Small-scale, focused impact. Emergency grants for students in crisis. Exactly what you needed and couldn't access. We can build from there. The conversation shifted into logistics and planning, Sarah's experience translating Lena's raw vision into actionable steps. They would need funding, which Sarah assured her wouldn't be difficult given the attention Lena's story had generated. They would need criteria for grant awards, application processes, oversight structures. But beneath all the practicalities, Lena felt something taking shape that was larger than her personal comeback, a way to transform her suffering into something that might prevent others from experiencing the same. The fellowship decision arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Lena had submitted her application. She was at the Steinway Society when her phone rang, Dr. Avery's name appearing on the screen. The director called me directly, he said without preamble. They want you, Lena. Full fellowship, starting next month. Stipend, coaching, performance opportunities, the whole package. They were unanimous. Lena sat down on the piano bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. They said yes? They said absolutely yes. The director told me your audition recording was the most emotionally compelling performance they'd reviewed in 5 years. The technical execution combined with the interpretive depth. You stood out in a pool of candidates who've been training at top conservatories without interruption. You did that after 8 months on the street. His voice carried unmistakable pride. You're the real thing, my dear. Now the world gets to see it. After the call ended, Lena sat alone with the news, trying to absorb what it meant. A fellowship with the New York Philharmonic, professional recognition at 19. A path forward that didn't require returning to student status, didn't require pretending she was the same person who'd left the conservatory 8 months ago. She played a few notes on the piano in front of her, testing how the news felt in her hands. The music that emerged was tentative at first, then increasingly confident. Chopin again, but this time the nocturne in E-flat major, something beautiful and lyrical and full of hope instead of fury. The practice room door opened quietly, and Lena looked up to find a young woman hovering in the doorway. She was maybe 22, holding a violin case and wearing the careful expression of someone trying not to intrude. I'm sorry, the woman said. I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted to say I saw your video, the one from the restaurant. I'm a student at Juilliard and I've been struggling with whether to continue. The cost, the pressure, wondering if it's worth it. But watching you play, hearing you talk about how music matters, even when everything else falls apart, it reminded me why I started in the first place. Lena stood, moved by the raw honesty in the stranger's voice. What's your name? Maya Patterson. It's worth it, Maya, Lena said firmly. Whatever struggle you're facing, whatever makes you doubt, the music is worth fighting for. I promise you that. Maya smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, and disappeared back into the hallway. But the encounter stayed with Lena for the rest of the day, a tangible reminder that her story had rippled outward in ways she was only beginning to understand. Marcus Webb's article published in the Manhattan Arts Review that Friday, and within hours it had been picked up by national outlets. The piece was everything Marcus had promised, not trauma porn, but a careful investigation into systemic failures, using Lena's story as a framework for examining how many talented young people were being lost to preventable crises. The article included interviews with social workers who explained how aging out of youth services at 18 left young people vulnerable. It featured conservatory administrators who admitted their protocols weren't designed for students experiencing catastrophic loss. It highlighted housing advocates who detailed the inadequacies of the shelter system for young adults. And threaded through it all was Lena's voice, honest and unflinching, refusing to let her suffering be sanitized or simplified. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The article was shared hundreds of thousands of times within the first day. Editorials spawned in major newspapers, opinion pieces from politicians and educators and artists. Conservatories across the country announced reviews of their student support policies. New York's mayor held a press conference about expanding services for homeless youth. And in the middle of the storm, Lena tried to maintain the equilibrium she'd been carefully building. Daily practice sessions at the Steinway Society. Therapy appointments with Christine, where she processed the whiplash of going from invisible to unavoidable. Meetings with Sarah about the foundation, which now had a name, the Heart Foundation for Artists in Crisis, and actual funding commitments totaling over $200,000. People want to help, Sarah explained when Lena expressed disbelief at the numbers. Your story gave them a concrete way to channel that impulse. The donations are coming from everywhere. Major donors, yes, but also small contributions from people who just want to feel like they're part of something good. The conservatory had stopped pushing for her return once they learned about the fellowship, though Professor Chen had called personally to express her joy at Lena's success. I knew you were exceptional, Chen said during their conversation. I tried to fight for you when everything happened, but I didn't fight hard enough. I'm sorry for that, but I'm so proud of where you've landed. The apology meant more than Lena expected it to. Not because it changed what had happened, but because it acknowledged that adults who should have protected her had failed. The validation of having her experience recognized, not dismissed or minimized, felt like its own form of healing. Graham Kingsley had largely disappeared from public view following the viral video, though reports suggested he'd resigned from several boards and his hotel had experienced a significant drop in bookings. Lena tried not to feel satisfaction at his downfall, but she couldn't quite manage complete indifference either. He'd been cruel when she was at her most vulnerable, had turned her desperation into entertainment. That he was facing consequences for that cruelty felt like a small measure of justice. But she thought about him sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Wondered if he understood what he'd actually done wrong, or if he just regretted getting caught. Wondered if people like him were capable of real change, or if their privilege insulated them too thoroughly from the consequences of their actions. The fellowship began in early March, and from the first day, Lena knew she'd made the right choice. The other fellows were serious musicians, all in their early 20s, all navigating the difficult transition from student to professional. They treated her with cautious respect, aware of her viral fame, but uncertain how to address it. It was a cellist named David who finally broke the ice during their first group rehearsal. So, are we just going to pretend we haven't all watched your video like 50 times? Or can we acknowledge that you're kind of a legend? The room went silent, everyone frozen in awkward discomfort. Then Lena laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even her. Please, can we just be normal? I'm so tired of being treated like I'm made of glass or like I'm going to break down if someone mentions what happened. Deal, David said with a grin. But for the record, your interpretation of Winter Wind was absolutely savage, in the best way. They rehearsed Brahms that afternoon, and for the first time in months, Lena felt like just a musician among musicians. Not a symbol, not a survivor, just someone making music with other people who cared about getting the phrasing exactly right and arguing about tempo and laughing when someone came in 2 measures early. The fellowship came with performance opportunities, and the first one arrived faster than Lena anticipated. A chamber recital at Carnegie's Weill Recital Hall in 3 weeks, open to the public, reviewed by major critics. The pressure should have been crushing, but Lena found herself excited instead of terrified. She chose her program carefully, working with her assigned coach, a pianist named Robert Chen who'd performed with the Philharmonic for 20 years, Schubert's Impromptus, Ravel's Pavane for a Dead Princess, and inevitably Chopin. Not Winter Wind. She wasn't ready to return to that piece in a formal concert setting. Instead, she selected the Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece that required both technical brilliance and deep emotional connection. The audience will come expecting the girl from the video, Robert warned during one of their coaching sessions. They'll want drama and triumph and inspiration. You need to decide how much you're willing to give them versus how much you're protecting for yourself. I don't know how to separate the two anymore, Lena admitted. Everything I play is colored by what I've been through. I can't pretend otherwise. Then don't pretend, Robert said simply. Let it inform the music, but don't let it define you. You're not just the homeless girl who made good. You're a serious artist with a long career ahead of you. This performance is about establishing that identity. The days leading up to the recital were consumed with practice and preparation, but Lena made time for other commitments too. The Heart Foundation had officially launched, with its first round of emergency grants going to 5 students in crisis situations across the tri-state area. Sarah handled most of the administration, but Lena insisted on reviewing each application personally, seeing herself in every story of sudden loss and systemic failure. One application came from a young composer at SUNY Purchase whose mother had died of cancer, leaving him unable to afford his final semester's tuition. Another was from a dancer at a small conservatory in Boston who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to live. Each story was different in its details, but achingly similar in its pattern. Talented young people encountering crises that the system wasn't designed to catch. We're helping 5 people, Lena said to Sarah after approving the grants. 5 out of thousands who need it. How is that enough? It's not enough, Sarah agreed, but it's 5 more than were being helped before. You build movements one person at a time, Lena. You can't save everyone, but you can save someone. And those someones will go on to help others. That's how change spreads. The night before the recital, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of her building, footsteps in the hallway, distant music from a neighbor's apartment, the radiator clanking as it heated the March chill. Sounds of normal life, of stability, of home. Things she'd almost forgotten existed. Her phone buzzed with the text from Dr. Avery. Tomorrow you show them who you are, not who they expect, who you truly are. I'll be in the audience, proud regardless of a single note. She thought about the Lena who'd walked into the Meridian Grand 6 weeks ago, desperate and invisible, and convinced she'd lost everything that mattered. That girl had been ready to accept humiliation for a meal, had been so ground down by survival that she'd almost forgotten what it meant to hope. But that girl had also walked to a piano and played Chopin like her life depended on it, had stood in front of cameras and refused to be just a victim or just an inspiration, insisting on being a whole person with agency and anger and purpose. Both versions were true. Both versions were her. The recital hall was smaller than Carnegie's main stage, but still intimidating, with perfect acoustics and seating for about 200. When Lena arrived for her sound check that afternoon, she found the space already set with flowers and programs, her name printed in elegant typeface. Lena Hart, piano, New York Philharmonic Fellowship Recital. She sat at the Steinway Concert Grand and played through sections of her program, adjusting to the hall's acoustics and the piano's particular responsiveness. Robert sat in the 10th row, listening with the focused attention of someone analyzing every choice. Your Schubert is lovely, he called out after she finished the impromptu in A-flat. But I'm hearing carefulness. You're being so precise that you're losing the spontaneity. Trust yourself more. Lena nodded, taking the feedback without defensiveness. 6 weeks ago, criticism would have devastated her fragile confidence. Now she understood it as the gift it was. Someone invested enough in her success to demand her best work. The audience began arriving 2 hours before the performance, and Lena watched from backstage as the seats filled. She spotted Dr. Avery in the 3rd row, distinguished and attentive. Sarah sat nearby, flanked by several board members from the Arts Foundation. Christine had come, offering a small wave when she caught Lena's eye. Marcus was there with his notebook, ready to review the performance for the Arts Review. But there were also strangers, lots of them. People who'd seen the video, who'd read the article, who wanted to witness the next chapter of a story they'd been following. Lena could see phones being carefully positioned to record, despite the hall's official policy against it. The stage manager gave her the 5-minute warning, and Lena took a moment alone in the green room. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, no longer the hollow-eyed girl in 3 jackets and fingerless gloves. Her hair was professionally cut now, framing a face that had started to regain healthy weight. She wore a simple black dress that Sarah had helped her choose, elegant without being flashy. She looked like what she was, a serious musician about to give a serious performance. The walk onto stage felt both eternal and instantaneous. The applause that greeted her was warm and encouraging, but Lena barely heard it. Her focus had narrowed to the piano, to the music, to the conversation she was about to have with composers who'd been dead for over a century. She sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, placed her hands on her lap, and took a breath. Then she began the Schubert, letting the notes emerge gently, conversationally, trusting Robert's advice about spontaneity. The music flowed from her fingers with a naturalness she hadn't expected. The impromptus were about capturing fleeting moments, ephemeral emotions that couldn't be sustained but could be crystallized in sound. Lena played them with the understanding of someone who knew how quickly beauty could vanish, how precious each moment was. The Ravel came next, its melancholic beauty filling the hall with something that felt almost sacred. She thought about her parents as she played, letting their memory inform the music without overwhelming it. This was her tribute to them, this dedication to the art they'd supported so completely. The Chopin Ballade closed the first half, and Lena felt the audience lean in as she began the famous opening. This was the piece everyone was waiting for, the test of whether she could deliver Chopin again after the viral Winter Wind performance. The ballade was different, more narrative, building through distinct sections that told a story without words. She played it as a journey, starting from uncertainty and building toward resolution. The technical passages came easily, her fingers remembering patterns they'd practiced thousands of times. But she also found room for rubato, for personal interpretation, for the subtle variations in tempo and dynamics that made a performance alive, rather than merely accurate. The final cascade of notes descended like a waterfall, and Lena let the last chord ring until it faded completely into silence. The pause before applause felt like holding her breath underwater, and then the audience erupted. They were standing. Not everyone, but enough that Lena could see the movement rippling through the hall. Dr. Avery had tears streaming down his face. Sarah was clapping so hard it must have hurt. And scattered throughout the audience, she saw faces reflecting recognition and joy and something that looked almost like gratitude. The intermission passed in a blur of adrenaline and distracted conversation with the stage manager. When Lena returned for the second half, she felt settled in a way she hadn't during the first. This was her world. This was where she belonged. She played Debussy with delicate precision, then tackled Beethoven's Tempest Sonata with fire that earned another round of enthusiastic applause. Her final piece was her own choice, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, arranged for solo piano. It was unexpected for a classical recital, almost irreverent, but Lena had insisted. "This is American music," she'd told Robert when he questioned the choice. "It's about mixing high and low, classical training and jazz freedom, European tradition, and American innovation. That's exactly who I am right now, someone who's been broken and rebuilt into something that doesn't fit the traditional molds." The Gershwin brought the audience to their feet again, the familiar strains of the opening clarinet glissando translated into cascading piano runs that made people smile with recognition. When Lena played the final triumphant chords, she knew she'd accomplished what she'd set out to do. Not replicate the viral video, but establish herself as an artist with range and depth and a unique voice. The standing ovation continued long enough that Lena had to take 3 bows. On the final one, she noticed movement in the back of the hall, someone standing in the doorway, late arrival watching from the distance. The figure was too far away to identify, but something about the silhouette seemed familiar. Backstage, Lena was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Dr. Avery embraced her with grandfatherly pride. Sarah was already fielding performance requests from people who'd watched and wanted to book her for their own venues. Christine simply squeezed her hand and said, "You were radiant up there." Marcus approached with his notebook, already formulating the review he'd write. "That was extraordinary, Lena. Not just technically proficient, genuinely moving. You've proved you're not a one-hit wonder." "I was never trying to be a wonder at all," Lena replied. "I just wanted to play music again." "Well, you're doing considerably more than that now," Marcus said with a smile. "That performance is going to generate significant attention. Are you prepared for what comes next?" Before Lena could answer, the stage manager appeared with a message. "There's someone asking to see you. He's waiting in the lobby. Says his name is Graham Kingsley." The name hit Lena like cold water, freezing her mid-breath. Graham Kingsley. Here. Now. after everything. You don't have to see him, Sarah said immediately, her voice protective. I can have security remove him if you want. But Lena found herself curious despite her instinct to refuse. What could he possibly want? Why would he show up here, at her moment of triumph, after being so thoroughly vilified by the same public that was now celebrating her? I'll talk to him, she said, surprising everyone including herself. But not alone. Sarah, will you come with me? They found Graham waiting near the entrance, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a space where everyone who passed recognized him and offered expressions ranging from contempt to pity. He'd aged in the 6 weeks since their encounter, or perhaps Lena was just seeing him clearly for the first time. Without the armor of arrogance, he looked like what he was, a wealthy man in his 60s who'd made a terrible mistake and was still figuring out how to live with the consequences. Miss Hart, he said when he saw her approach, thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, Lena replied honestly. What are you doing here, Mr. Kingsley? I came to hear you play, and to apologize, properly, not through lawyers or press statements. What I did at the restaurant was cruel and inexcusable. I saw a vulnerable person, and I turned your suffering into entertainment. There's no justification for that. Lena studied his face, searching for signs of performance or manipulation. But what she saw looked like genuine remorse, the kind that came from actual consequences rather than just being caught. Why should I believe you? She asked quietly. You shouldn't, Graham said. I've spent 60 years believing that wealth and position gave me the right to test people, to make them prove their worth to me. It took being publicly humiliated myself to understand how deeply wrong that was. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that watching what you've built from that horrible moment, the foundation, the advocacy, the way you've used your platform, it's changed how I see the world. Sarah remained silent but alert, positioned protectively beside Lena. Actions matter more than apologies, Lena said finally. If you really understand what you did wrong, prove it. The Hart Foundation needs funding and support. Put your money where your mouth is. Graham nodded slowly. I've already made arrangements to donate, substantially, but I wanted to tell you directly that it's not about buying redemption. It's about trying to repair some of the damage my mindset has caused. Not just to you, but to everyone I've dismissed or diminished over the years. I don't forgive you, Lena said, the words clear and firm. Maybe someday, but not today. What you did hurt me deeply, even if good ultimately came from it. But I accept your apology, and if you actually follow through with supporting the foundation, then maybe you'll prove that people can change. Graham extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Lena shook it. Not warmly, but with the acknowledgement that growth, even uncomfortable growth, deserved recognition. After he left, Sarah turned to Lena with undisguised admiration. That took remarkable grace. I don't feel graceful, Lena admitted. I feel exhausted. Can we go home? The apartment in Morningside Heights felt like sanctuary after the intensity of the performance and its aftermath. Lena changed into comfortable clothes and made herself tea, going through the familiar motions of an evening routine that still felt miraculous in its normalcy. Her phone was exploding with messages, congratulations, review quotes, interview requests. But she set it aside, choosing instead to sit by the window and watch the city lights. She thought about the journey from that desperate morning at the Meridian Grand to this moment of professional triumph. 6 weeks. Just 6 weeks between homelessness and a standing ovation at Carnegie. The velocity of change should have been disorienting, but instead it felt like restoration. Not becoming someone new, but recovering who she'd always been underneath the survival. Tomorrow she would deal with the reviews and the requests, and the continued building of both her career and her foundation. Tomorrow she would practice and plan, and continue the work of transforming her trauma into purpose. But tonight she just sat with the quiet knowledge that she'd done it. She'd walked onto that stage and proved, to the audience, to the critics, to herself, that she was a serious artist whose story included but wasn't defined by suffering. The music had saved her, but she'd saved herself too. The reviews of Lena's recital appeared over the following days, and they were better than she'd dared to hope. The New York Times praised her technical precision married to profound emotional intelligence. while the classical music blogs dissected her interpretations with the kind of serious attention reserved for established artists, not 19-year-old newcomers. Marcus's piece in the Manhattan Arts Review positioned the performance as a turning point, the moment when Lena Hart transformed from viral sensation into legitimate musical force. But it was a smaller review, published in a college newspaper by a student critic, that hit Lena hardest. Watching Hart play, you forget about the backstory, the young writer observed. You stop seeing the homeless girl who went viral and start seeing simply a musician who understands something essential about translating human experience into sound. That's the highest compliment I can offer. Lena read that passage 3 times, feeling something settle in her chest. The validation she'd been seeking wasn't about proving her suffering had been real or her comeback inspiring. It was about being recognized for the thing that had always defined her, before the tragedy and beyond it, her artistry. The fellowship accelerated after the recital, bringing a flood of opportunities that Robert helped her navigate with strategic care. Performance offers came from chamber groups, orchestras, summer festivals, but they chose selectively, building a trajectory rather than accepting everything. "You're not desperate anymore," Robert reminded her during one planning session. "You don't have to say yes to every opportunity just because it's offered. Think about what serves your artistic development, not just what provides validation." It was advice Lena needed to hear. The girl who'd played for food 6 weeks ago still lived somewhere inside her, whispering that she should grab every chance before it disappeared. But she was learning to trust that success built thoughtfully would last longer than success grabbed frantically. The Hart Foundation grew faster than anyone had anticipated. Graham Kingsley's donation, a staggering $500,000, had been followed by contributions from foundations, individual donors, and even some of Lena's fellow musicians who gave modest amounts that felt more meaningful than the large checks. Within 2 months, they'd awarded grants to 23 students in crisis, and applications continued to pour in from across the country. Sarah had hired a small staff to manage the day-to-day operations, freeing Lena to focus on the work only she could do, being the public face, reviewing applications, and shaping the foundation's mission. They'd also established partnerships with conservatories and universities, creating early warning systems to catch students in crisis before they fell through the cracks entirely. "We're building something that could actually change the landscape," Sarah said during a board meeting in late April. "The initial data suggests we're preventing dropouts and homelessness at a rate significantly higher than existing support systems. We're filling a gap that nobody else was addressing." Lena listened to the statistics and success stories, feeling pride mixed with persistent awareness of how much need remained unmet. For every student they helped, dozens more sent applications they had to decline due to limited resources. The foundation was making a difference, yes, but the problems it addressed were so much larger than any single organization could solve. "I want to testify," she said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. "Congress is holding hearings on arts funding and student support next month. I want to tell them what happened to me and show them the data about how many talented young people we're losing. We need systemic change, not just private charity." The room went silent. Sarah's expression was carefully neutral, but Lena could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. The potential benefits weighed against the risks of putting Lena in a highly political spotlight. "That's a significant step," Dr. Avery said carefully. He'd joined the foundation's board shortly after its launch, lending his reputation and connections to the cause. "Congressional testimony is public record, subject to intense scrutiny. Are you prepared for that level of exposure?" "I've been exposed since the video went viral," Lena replied. "At least this way the exposure serves a purpose beyond entertainment. If my story can help secure funding for arts programs and student support services, then it's worth whatever discomfort comes with it." Christine, who'd also joined the board, spoke up. "From a mental health perspective, I'd want to make sure you're doing this from a place of strength, not obligation. You don't owe the world your trauma just because people are interested in hearing about it." "I know," Lena said, "but this isn't about owing anyone anything. It's about understanding that I have access to rooms and platforms that most people in my situation never get. If I don't use that access to advocate for change, then what was the point of everything I went through?" The board agreed to support her testimony, and within a week, arrangements had been made. Lena would appear before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions in early June, part of a broader hearing on student mental health and support services. The preparation was intense. Sarah connected her with advocacy groups who coached her on congressional testimony, how to tell her story effectively in a limited time, how to handle hostile questions, how to pivot from personal narrative to policy recommendations. Marcus helped her draft written testimony that would be submitted for the official record. Christine worked with her on managing the emotional toll of revisiting her trauma in such a public forum. But it was Professor Chen, her former teacher from Manhattan Conservatory, who provided the most valuable preparation. Chen had reached out shortly after the recital, apologizing again for not fighting harder to keep Lena in the program and offering to help however she could. Now she sat across from Lena in a practice room at the Steinway Society, listening to draft after draft of testimony. "You're too apologetic," Chen said after Lena's third run-through. "You keep framing your homelessness as something that happened because you didn't know better, didn't understand the systems. That's true, but it obscures the real point, that the systems themselves were designed in ways that guaranteed you'd fail." "I don't want to sound like I'm blaming everyone else for my problems," Lena protested. "You're not everyone else. You were an 18-year-old orphan navigating multiple bureaucracies during acute grief. The fact that you survived it all is extraordinary. The fact that you're thriving now is miraculous. But neither of those facts changes the reality that our institutions failed you catastrophically. Own that. Make them hear it." Lena revised her testimony with Chen's words in mind, stripping away the apologetic language and replacing it with clear-eyed analysis of exactly where each system had broken down. The conservatory that revoked her scholarship without checking if she needed support. The social services that provided temporary shelter but no pathway to stability. The housing system that evicted her because she didn't understand tenant rights. The healthcare system that never addressed her trauma because she had no insurance and no idea how to access mental health services. Each failure was individual, but together they formed a pattern that trapped vulnerable young people in cycles of crisis they couldn't escape without extraordinary luck. The fellowship performances continued through May, each one building Lena's reputation and confidence. She played a concerto with a chamber orchestra in Boston, gave a solo recital at a festival in Vermont, collaborated with a string quartet on a contemporary piece that challenged her in entirely new ways. The work was demanding but fulfilling, pushing her to grow as an artist while also proving she could sustain a professional career. Between performances and foundation work and testimony preparation, Lena maintained her routine with Christine. The therapy sessions had evolved from crisis management to genuine processing, digging into layers of grief and trauma that Lena had buried under survival's demands. "I'm angry," she admitted during one session in late May. "Not all the time, but it comes in waves. Angry at the drunk driver who killed my parents, angry at the conservatory, angry at every person who walked past me on the street and didn't see me, angry at myself for not being stronger, smarter, more capable of navigating it all." "That anger is valid," Christine assured her. "You've been focused on moving forward, on building something positive from terrible circumstances. But you also need to make room for the rage and grief that are legitimate responses to what you experienced. Those feelings don't make you ungrateful or weak. They make you human." Lena cried more in that session than she had in weeks, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she'd lost and what she'd survived. Her parents were gone and never coming back. No amount of success or advocacy would change that fundamental fact. She'd spent 8 months experiencing homelessness that had left scars both visible and invisible. The girl she'd been before the accident was gone too, transformed by suffering she never should have endured. But in making room for that grief, Lena also found room for acceptance. She would never be the person she'd been at 17, untouched by tragedy. But she could be someone deeper, more compassionate, more aware of how fragile the line was between stability and crisis. "I want to visit their graves," she said as the session ended. "I haven't been since the funeral. I wasn't ready before, but I think I am now." The cemetery in Queens was peaceful on the Saturday afternoon when Lena finally made the trip. She brought flowers, white roses, her mother's favorite, and stood before the shared headstone bearing both her parents' names, Elizabeth and Michael Hart. Beloved parents and partners. Their dates of birth and death, the dash between containing entire lives that Lena was only now beginning to understand as more than just the framework for her own existence. "I did it," she said aloud, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "I know you can't hear me, but I need to say it anyway. I survived. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm actually living again. I'm playing piano, like you always believed I could. I'm helping other people, trying to make something good come from losing you. I miss you every single day, but I'm okay. I'm going to be okay." She stayed for over an hour, telling them about the foundation, about the fellowship, about the testimony she'd give in a week. She told them about the apartment in Morningside Heights, about practicing at the Steinway Society, about the people who'd shown up to help when help was desperately needed. She told them about Graham Kingsley and his donation, about Dr. Avery's mentorship, about Sarah's fierce advocacy, and she told them she forgave them for dying, a thing she hadn't known she needed to say until the words emerged. She forgave them for leaving her, for not surviving the accident, for being human and vulnerable and mortal. The forgiveness didn't erase her grief, but it somehow made the grief more bearable. The day of the congressional testimony arrived with the humid heat of early June settling over Washington, D.C. Lena wore a simple navy suit that Sarah had helped her choose, professional without being stuffy. Her testimony was polished and practiced, her supporting materials organized, her nerves managed through breathing exercises Christine had taught her. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected, but still intimidating, with senators arranged in a semicircle and cameras capturing every angle for C-SPAN broadcast. Lena was one of several witnesses testifying that day, scheduled to speak after a university president and before a mental health policy expert. She listened carefully to the earlier testimony, noting which senators asked thoughtful questions and which seemed more interested in scoring political points. When her turn came, she walked to the witness table with her head high and her hands steady. "Good morning," she began after being sworn in. "My name is Lena Hart. I'm 19 years old, and 8 months ago I was homeless and living on the streets of Manhattan, despite being a scholarship student at one of the country's most prestigious music conservatories. I'm here to tell you how that happened, and more importantly, to tell you how we can prevent it from happening to thousands of other young people who are currently falling through the exact same cracks I fell through." She told her story with the clarity and precision she'd practiced, no longer apologetic but direct and unflinching. She described losing her parents, the cascade of administrative failures, the months of desperate survival. But she also pivoted quickly to data, the Hart Foundation's statistics on how many students faced similar crises, the success rate of their intervention programs, the cost-benefit analysis showing that early support was dramatically cheaper than dealing with the long-term consequences of student homelessness. The current system operates on the assumption that 18-year-olds are adults capable of navigating complex bureaucracies during their worst moments, Lena said. But that assumption is fundamentally flawed. I was an adult legally, but I was also a traumatized orphan with no family support, no experience with housing law or insurance regulations, no understanding of what resources existed. Every system I encountered demanded that I already know things nobody had taught me. Senator Williams from Massachusetts leaned forward. "Ms. Hart, your story is certainly compelling, but couldn't it be argued that personal responsibility plays a role here? That students need to be proactive about seeking help?" Lena had been prepared for this question, had practiced her response with Sarah a dozen times. "Senator, with respect, I was proactive. I showed up at social services offices. I went to the conservatory administration. I tried to access shelter beds, but each system had eligibility requirements or waiting lists or paperwork demands that I couldn't meet while also trying to survive on the street. The question isn't whether students should be responsible. It's whether our institutions should be responsive when young people are in crisis." The senator nodded thoughtfully, and Lena saw several others taking notes. Senator Park from California asked about the Hart Foundation's model and whether it could be scaled nationally. Lena walked through their approach: emergency grants, mental health support, legal aid, housing assistance, and emphasized that private charity, while helpful, couldn't replace robust public support systems. "Our foundation has helped 73 students so far," she said. "That's 73 talented young people who might have been lost to homelessness, addiction, or worse. But we've had to turn away nearly 400 applicants due to limited funding. The need is enormous, and it's growing." Federal investment in student support services isn't just compassionate, it's economically smart. We're losing artists, scientists, teachers, innovators to preventable crises. That's a loss we can't afford as a country. The testimony lasted 90 minutes, including questions from 12 different senators. Some were genuinely curious and engaged. Others seemed more interested in using her story to support predetermined political positions. But throughout it all, Lena remained focused on her core message. The systems were broken, the solutions were achievable, and the cost of inaction was measured in lost potential and unnecessary suffering. When it finally ended, Lena left the hearing room emotionally drained but satisfied. She'd done what she came to do, used her platform to advocate for change that was larger than her individual story. Sarah met her in the hallway, pulling her into a fierce hug. "You were phenomenal. Several senators' staffers have already reached out wanting to discuss legislation. This is going to have real impact." Dr. Avery had flown down from New York to watch the testimony, and he approached with obvious pride. "You've become quite the advocate, my dear. Your parents would be extraordinarily proud of who you've become." The words hit Lena harder than expected, emotion welling up that she had to blink back quickly. "Thank you. That means everything." They flew back to New York that evening, and Lena spent the flight staring out the window at clouds illuminated by the setting sun. She thought about how far she'd come since that January afternoon when she'd walked into the Meridian Grand expecting nothing and receiving everything. 4.5 months. Just 4.5 months between desperation and advocacy, between homelessness and congressional testimony. The velocity still felt surreal sometimes, but Lena was learning to trust it, learning to believe that she deserved the opportunities presenting themselves, that her success wasn't luck, but the result of talent meeting, preparation meeting, support. Summer brought a new rhythm to Lena's life. The fellowship continued with outdoor performances and festival appearances. The foundation expanded to include a mentorship program, pairing students in crisis with established artists who could provide guidance and support. And Lena's own performance schedule filled with engagements that reflected her growing reputation. A solo recital at the Kennedy Center, a concerto appearance with the Philadelphia Orchestra, an invitation to perform at the Ravinia Festival in Chicago. But she also made time for things that weren't about career building or advocacy work. She took piano lessons just for the joy of learning, exploring repertoire she'd never performed publicly. She went to museums and movies, slowly rebuilding a social life beyond the intense focus of survival and recovery. She made friends among the other fellows, people who knew her as Lena the musician rather than Lena the viral sensation. And she started dating, cautiously and awkwardly, a violinist named James who'd performed with her in one of the chamber concerts. He knew her story, but treated her like a person first, an artist second, and a symbol not at all. Their first date was a walk through Central Park, followed by terrible pizza, and Lena found herself laughing more than she had in months. "Is it weird that I feel guilty for being happy?" she asked Christine during their next session. "Like I'm betraying my parents or forgetting what I went through?" "It's not weird at all," Christine assured her. "Survivor's guilt is common, especially when you've experienced profound loss. But your parents didn't raise you to be permanently sad. They invested in your music, your education, your future. Living that future fully, including finding joy and connection, honors their memory far more than staying stuck in grief would." The 1-year anniversary of her parents' death arrived in late August, and Lena took the day off from all obligations. She visited the cemetery again, bringing fresh flowers and spending hours just sitting with her memories. She played through old photo albums she'd retrieved from storage, looking at pictures of birthday parties and recitals and ordinary family dinners that had seemed mundane at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. She cried, but the tears felt different than they had in the early months, less desperate, more healing. A natural expression of love and loss rather than a wound that wouldn't close. That evening, she gave a private performance at the Steinway Society, just her and the piano and the memory of 2 people who'd believed in her before she believed in herself. She played pieces they'd loved, pieces that reminded her of specific moments, pieces that said things words couldn't capture. When she finished, the practice room was dark except for a single lamp, and Lena felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before the accident. Her parents were gone, and that would always hurt. But she was still here, still playing, still becoming the artist they'd helped her start to be. The fall brought the announcement Lena had been waiting for. Federal legislation based partly on her testimony was moving through Congress, a comprehensive student support bill that would fund mental health services, emergency housing assistance, and crisis intervention programs at colleges and universities nationwide. It wasn't everything she'd advocated for, and the funding levels were smaller than ideal, but it represented real progress. "You did this," Sarah said when the news broke. "Your testimony, your foundation, your willingness to be public about your experience, it created momentum for change." "We did this," Lena corrected. "All of us. Everyone who supported the foundation, who shared the story, who contacted their representatives. I was just the voice." The Heart Foundation's first anniversary celebration took place in October, a fundraising gala that doubled as a showcase for some of the students they'd helped. Maya, the Juilliard violinist who'd approached Lena in the practice room months ago, performed a beautiful piece she'd composed herself. A young composer from Boston whose mother had died of cancer conducted the premiere of a work dedicated to the foundation. And Lena herself played Chopin, not Winter Wind this time, but the Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece she'd played alone in her apartment the day she learned about the fellowship. The gala raised over $300,000 and attracted commitments from several major foundations to provide ongoing support. The Heart Foundation was no longer a scrappy startup running on viral attention. It was becoming an established institution with the infrastructure to create lasting change. Graham Kingsley attended the gala, sitting quietly in the back and writing another substantial check without seeking recognition or redemption. Lena acknowledged him with a nod across the room, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of something like understanding. People could change, she was learning. Not always, and not easily, but sometimes. The fellowship concluded in December with a final showcase concert featuring all 6 fellows. Lena performed the Brahms Second Piano Concerto with the New York Philharmonic, a massive work that required both technical brilliance and mature interpretation. She'd worked on it for months with Robert, digging into the architecture and emotional landscape of a piece that demanded everything she had to give. The performance felt like a rival, like stepping fully into her identity as a serious artist. The audience's response was enthusiastic, but more meaningful was Robert's comment afterward. "You've become the musician I always knew you could be. Not just technically accomplished, but emotionally honest and artistically fearless." In the green room after the concert, surrounded by flowers and congratulations, Lena took a moment to herself. She thought about the girl who'd walked into the Meridian Grand 11 months ago, hungry and desperate and half convinced she'd lost everything that mattered. That girl had been wrong. She hadn't lost everything. She'd lost her parents and her stability and her naive assumption that talent and hard work were sufficient to guarantee success. But she'd kept her music, her resilience, her capacity for hope, even when hope seemed ridiculous. And she'd gained things too. Understanding of systemic failures that most people never had to confront. Empathy for others in crisis that came from lived experience rather than abstract sympathy. A platform to advocate for change and the courage to use it. A community of people who'd shown up when showing up mattered most. The fellowship was ending, but Lena's career was just beginning. She had performance contracts lined up for the next year, including a European tour and a recording contract with a major classical label. The Heart Foundation was expanding to include chapters in Boston and San Francisco, with plans for nationwide reach within 2 years. And she'd been invited to join the faculty at Manhattan Conservatory as a visiting artist, teaching the next generation while continuing her own performance career. It was more than she'd imagined possible on that January afternoon, when playing piano for food had seemed like a humiliating last resort. It was more than she'd dared to hope for during the months of sleeping in subway stations and wondering if she'd survive until spring, but it was also exactly what she'd always worked toward, before tragedy derailed everything. She was becoming the artist her parents had believed she could be, the musician who could communicate something essential about being human through the language of sound. The night of the final fellowship concert, Lena stood on the stage of David Geffen Hall and looked out at the audience that had come to hear her play. She saw Dr. Avery, who'd recognized her talent when she needed recognition most. Sarah, who'd turned viral attention into sustainable support. Christine, who'd helped her process trauma into strength. Marcus, who told her story with dignity and truth. Professor Chen, who'd never stopped believing in her potential. She saw the students from the Heart Foundation, young people who'd been caught by the safety net she'd helped build from her own falling. She saw James, the violinist who'd made her laugh, and reminded her that life could include joy alongside purpose. And in her mind's eye, she saw her parents, sitting in the third row like they had at every recital, her mother already crying with pride and her father holding the terrible coffee he always bought and never finished. Lena placed her hands on the piano keys and began to play, the opening notes of the Brahms filling the hall with sound that was both familiar and transformed. She played for the audience in front of her and the memory behind her and the future ahead of her. She played with all the technical skills she'd built through years of practice and all the emotional depth she'd earned through suffering and survival. She played like someone who'd lost everything and found herself anyway. She played like someone who knew that worth wasn't worn or inherited or granted by others, but proven through dedication and refined through adversity. She played like someone who understood, finally and fully, that she belonged exactly where she was, not despite her journey, but because of it. The music soared through the concert hall, reaching into corners and hearts, connecting strangers through shared experience of beauty. And Lena Hart, 19 years old and no longer homeless, no longer invisible, no longer just surviving, played on.